You've just entered the No Delusion Zone. I'm David Dubato. Today, my very special guest is Orysia Lutsevych. Orysia is the deputy director of the Russia and Eurasia Program and head of the Ukraine Forum at Chatham House in the UK. Orysia's research focuses on social change, the role of civil society in democratic transition in Eastern Europe, and, most recently, democratic resilience to foreign encroachment. She's the author of several Chatham House research publications, including Resilient Ukraine, Safeguarding Society from Russian Aggression. Her media work includes contributions to the BBC, CNN, The Guardian, The Times, The Financial Times, The New York Times, and many others. I am very happy to have Orysia with us today on the No Delusion Zone. So without further ado, Orysia, welcome.
Thank you, David. Good to be with you. And I hope that zone is quite comfortable for people while we are debunking some of the myths, stereotypes, and delusions.
Well, to be honest with you, and very quickly, that's where the name came from, because after publishing several articles and doing some articles, I was deluged with the delusions of Russian sympathizers, shall we say, from the Kremlin sympathizers, bots, as well as MAGA Americans who also sympathize, unfortunately, with Putin. And they were delusional, and I just got really tired of it. And so I decided, nope, I have to establish a no delusion zone. And so delusions are not allowed here on the left or the right. So I just want to get that said from the outset. As I said to you off air, just before we went on, Orysia, it would be impossible to discuss Ukraine, the future of Ukraine, NATO, Europe, without mentioning Donald Trump. He's going to be inaugurated in 5 days as the new president of the United States of America, as well as commander-in-chief of the American military. A scary thought for many of us here in America, as well as in Ukraine and Europe, but it is a fact, nevertheless. What do you see from your research, from talking to leaders and just ordinary Ukrainians about what they see as the future for, let's just say, 2025, after Trump is inaugurated, as far as support for Ukraine and his negotiating, in quotes, peace settlements with Putin?
David, you're right that Trump is one of the biggest factors, not the only one, I'd like to say, but one of the biggest factors in this equation of how this war may end. There are still many unknowns, including Trump's own scenario for bringing it to a conclusion, as he would like to say. I think Ukrainians are waiting with a certain anxiety and hope, I'll be honest with you. So anxiety, of course, is connected with his possible sympathy or sympathizing to Putin. Ukrainians have seen many statements and that infamous summit in Helsinki, where actually Trump sided with Putin against his own intelligence community about whether Russia interfered into elections in the US in 2016 or not. There's fear that Trump will actually believe what Putin says rather than seeing for the facts on the ground about the nature of current Russian regime. So that's, and then also there's a fear of a hastily ceasefire and the pressure that Trump may put on Kiev to concede, to agree to a lousy deal that will jeopardize Ukrainian independence and future. Hope, on the other hand, comes from a certain disillusionment with late Biden. And the fact that the weapons were coming slow, the fact that the escalation management was always dominating the strategy on how assistance Ukraine is providing. And in a way, Biden only settled for denying Putin his war aims and not enabling Ukraine to actually succeed on the battlefield. So Ukrainians hope that Trump will be kind of more bold. And if Putin is not compromising, is not willing to end the war, then he indeed will provide everything Ukraine needs on the battlefield to defeat Russian formation on the sovereign territory of Ukraine. And this kind of peace through strength is something they hope for.
You brought up President Biden, who has just another few days to go in office. And so I want to touch upon that topic, that person, for a minute. My feelings on President Biden in terms of his support, how shall we say, of Ukraine are also very well known. He makes me very, very angry. I can't even express how angry it is. I made the analogy of Biden giving just enough aid to a dying patient in a hospital, just enough to keep him alive, even though he knows that he's going to eventually die if he doesn't give him any more antibiotics, for example. But he's just not able to do that. And so the patient eventually dies just for lack of more medicine. And let me ask you this. Your research is on disinformation. Your research is on civil society, on Russian society, Ukrainian society. In your opinion, why did President Biden and his advisors take that road, that extremely cautious road, instead of confronting Putin actually back in he wasn't in office in 2014, but certainly from February 24th of 2022, why wasn't he confronted by Biden in a much more forceful manner? Why did they buy all the excuses and threats?
Well, your question why is very legitimate, and kind of it hangs very high on Ukraine's minds. And one of the reasons why it's hard to understand is Biden knows Ukraine really well. Biden is somebody who has traveled to Ukraine as vice president under Obama. He was on Ukraine's dossier. He had Ukraine in his heart. He met the people. He met the both government, and he saw the courage that is inside Ukraine to resist Russian invasion back from 2014. So he should have known that Ukraine will resist, that Ukraine will put up a very serious fight when Russia will decide to invade. And I would go even a bit further. Why Biden, when he had this meeting in April with Putin in 2021 in Geneva, there was the summit when Russia started amassing the troops on Ukrainian border from spring, kind of threatening not just Ukraine, but all of Eastern Europe, and then sending this ultimatum basically to Washington ahead of invasion. Why Biden didn't take more resolute steps to deter the invasion? And I think, my answer is he didn't want to see a war between Russia and United States on his watch. And Putin shrewdly manipulated that fear that Biden had, that infamous reflexive control that the KGB and now later FSB is so good at, is basically exploiting the fear, putting Russian strategic nuclear forces on active alert right from day 2 of invasion in Ukraine, and saying, if you provide military lethal aid to Ukraine, the nukes are on the table. And since that, he knew that that will jeopardize decision making in the White House, and it will actually set two groups inside Pentagon: those who are doing nuclear, management and escalation management on one hand, and those who wanted actually for Ukraine to succeed on the battlefield. And it locked itself into this conundrum that Biden was not able to lead properly. And it was actually up to UK in these first days of Russian invasion to come fast forward in support of Ukraine. Then Secretary Ben Wallace, Secretary of Defense, was very clear in formulating what should be the outcome of this war, that Putin will not prevail. And then Boris Johnson took it further to saying that Ukraine must prevail. And that played a certain role. But Biden I think, showed his weakness. There was this moment when he went to Poland at the start of the invasion and met a lot of Ukrainian refugees. He was shattered by all these experiences. And then he spoke at the stadium, you may remember, and he said, for God's sake, that man cannot run Russia. And he spoke about Putin. And that was the right statement. And that was something that should have been a policy. This kind of dictatorship, autocratic dictatorship, is not just a threat to Ukraine, it's a threat to humanity as we know it. So, and then he retreated on that statement. Then they started, say, oh, well, that's not what Biden meant. It's not about regime change. This is the moment he showed the weakness. And this is the moment when Putin had the upper hand in the nuclear blackmail and also using all his agents throughout different European states, from Berlin to Paris to Hungary, to boost that escalation threat as if it was real, while we do know that it's not the case.
It's a failure. It was a failure of leadership, period. And I want to talk about that in a larger sphere here in just a moment, aside from Joe Biden. Orysia, are you familiar with a report that was out the beginning or latter part of 2021, written by a very well-respected American journalist who specializes in intelligence and national security, William Arkin? He wrote the piece, the report, for Newsweek magazine, and in that report, he detailed, according to his sources, and again, he's a very credible journalist, that at this time, CIA Director William Burns met with the Kremlin, not with Putin personally. He spoke to him on the phone. I think Putin was in Sochi at the time. And between the two of them, they laid out the ground rules, according to this report, for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And since Biden, as you know, is an old Cold Warrior, he still seems to think that Putin was playing by Cold War rules, by Soviet rules. And so between the two of them, they worked out the ground rules for how Russia was going to invade Ukraine, that if Russia did not go beyond Ukraine, essentially giving Ukraine to Russia, that NATO and the United States in particular would not intervene. They would send minimal support to Ukraine, but they would not intervene and stop the Russian invasion. I've written about this. I've spoken about that. It makes me apoplectic to even think about it. But again, I can't say that it for sure happened, except that, again, this journalist is very well respected. So have you heard that report? And even if you haven't, what do you think of that possibility, if in fact it was true?
Well, I think it's very good you mentioned it, especially because a lot of people hear now from Donald Trump that if he were the president of the United States, Russia would not have invaded. So, it's clear that this is not true. Putin had invasion planned. He had invasion on his mind. Why? Because he was not able to subjugate Ukraine with a limited military operation that he started from 2014. And this Minsk Normandy process that was supposed to kind of impose partial sovereignty of Ukraine and recognition of these enclaves that were Russia controlled in Donbass were supposed to hijack Ukraine's European integration and its future as part of Europe. So after that failed, he was set on invasion. And I wouldn't be surprised that this is the case, because we did see a very cautious assistance and very cautious rhetoric about what is the outcome that the United States is trying to achieve. And what was making me really angry is this mantra that the US will support Ukraine for as long as it takes. To achieve what? And the fact that Biden has never formulated the goal actually gives the opponents of support to Ukraine an upper hand, because they do not understand in genuine terms what is the goals that the United States is trying to achieve. It's unfortunate that is also kind of is an allusion to Afghanistan. There was an endless war. That was not clear what the United States was trying to achieve. So Biden played against Ukraine in that way. And he miscalculated about Putin, because we do see that he is not playing by any rules. Cold War, non-Cold War, he is actually committing war crimes in Ukraine. He is just this morning, we had another massive attack on Ukrainian energy infrastructure in western part of Ukraine, where listeners may not know, Ukraine has one of the largest gas storages in Europe. And these gas storages are used not only for Ukraine, but also for European energy companies. Putin wants to destroy that infrastructure. And imagine the environmental disaster if the largest gas tanks that are underground storages are exploding. So he wants to make scorched earth out of Ukraine, depopulated. It's a genocidal type of war that is here to erase Ukraine from the political map, a map of Europe. And that Biden should have known, understanding the type of man that is now in the Kremlin. And he didn't act. And I think Jake Sullivan was one of the weakest security advisors that we had in recent history of United States. He should have steered much better response to this invasion.
Second only to President Biden in criminality, and as far as I'm concerned, and not supporting Ukraine, is Jake Sullivan. Again, I've discussed him many, many times. He's a disgrace. I'm sorry, they both are in terms of their support for Ukraine. This is a lack of leadership. It's a lack of spine. It's cowardice. And not just this, it's obviously misperceptions, miscalculations, old, worn out Cold War thoughts that are no longer relative, and so forth and so on. Again, I know your research is into civil society and Russian disinformation and related topics. What are your thoughts about expanding this out to the other leaders in Europe, to NATO, the EU, and what I have said many times is their lack of commitment, their lack of courage, their cowardice? I've called it just that, cowardice, for responding forcefully to Putin's invasion of Ukraine, especially since the eastern countries, the eastern part of Europe, was under the boot of the Soviet Union for so many years and would stand to be invaded again if Russia succeeds in quashing Ukraine. Where is the lack of leadership there? Is it just from Russian disinformation? I don't think so. I lay this solely on the shoulders of the leadership, the elected leaders in Europe. What are your thoughts?
Well, the question of leadership is very important. And I think what brings to mind is actually Zelensky, first of all, because he was that leader that, born in the first days of war, outperformed himself, surprised millions of Ukrainians in how he was able to shape the narrative of this war, because this is what it is. Of course, there's a battle rages in the steppes and on the cities of Ukraine, but there's also a battle for the narrative. And Zelensky did it very rightly from the very beginning. He said it's the war for Ukraine's independence. It's also the war of Russia against the West and against the Western values and the Western way of life. And Ukraine wants to live like the Western way of life and is ready to die for these values. So, and it's also a blatant violation of all laws, UN Charter, and basic principle of cooperation between the states. So I think with his speeches, every evening now for almost 3 years in a row, Zelensky addresses the nation. There's not an evening he doesn't do it. And this is what I think European leaders should learn from President Zelensky at times of crisis, is that you cannot lead the nation into difficult and painful decisions, which we will increasingly need to take, without having those voters and citizens on board. They must understand what is at stake, and you must be honest with them. I think what we are seeing in Europe, of course, there are two elements to weak leadership. One is this kind of lethargic sleep that Europe is in after, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, and kind of settling into a perpetual prosperity world. It's like this illusion, if you want, that the world will be like that forever. And they didn't wake up yet to the fact that there's the new coalition of states, including in Europe led by Russia, to undermine that world. Russia was on purpose spinning the narratives that, oh, well, Ukraine is not worth your investment, it's just a corrupt basket case, that Russia is not really an enemy, we can supply you cheap energy. And they were actually buying influence, not just disinformation. We have seen scandals in the European Parliament. There are suspicions actually of current Chancellor Scholz, who was at that time for a finance minister when the Wirecard scandal happened, that was led by, all we know today is the GRU agent in Germany, who is now apparently Orthodox priest in Russia. So not knowing all of this, Russia has a huge infiltration into the European societies and high politics, and they wanted to basically co-opt, coerce, and to achieve their goals by disarming Europe ahead of its largest war planned in the 21st century. But I would like to say a word for a good leader, and I think it was Ursula von der Leyen. I think she actually was doing the impossible in order to keep the unity of the European Union. I think she actually pushed that decision to give Ukraine membership status. That is already a big win for Ukraine. That is a security for Ukraine's reconstruction and future, that Ukraine can emerge out of this war in a different with a different economic and political system. She did it, and she has great relations with President Zelensky, and they managed to convince Germany, Italy, and France. And if you look at these images, when the four of them traveled to Kiev to announce that Ukraine will become a member of the European Union and will start the accession process, that is a historic moment that is thanks to her leadership that has happened.
You know, you've said so much that needs to be unpacked, and I don't even think we have enough time to do it, but I'm going to try. You mentioned, well, we started off this part of the conversation about leadership, either the lack of it, or in President Zelensky's case, outstanding leadership. You mentioned the fact that he gives talks to the Ukrainian people every night. In my opinion, that's indispensable. That alone, I think, has almost brought the Ukrainian nation through these times to the current day that we're talking about right now. And that is the core, I think, of what I'm talking about, which is leadership. You don't need to talk to your population every night, although that's not a bad idea if you're a prime minister or a president. But during wartime, you need to address your population on a regular basis and let them know of the very serious, if not existential, threat to your nation, to Europe in general. That's not been done. I have yet. And even if we want to talk about Macron or any of the other leaders that have said some very good things, nobody has really laid out to their own people the existential threat that Russia poses to Europe should they prevail in Ukraine. It just hasn't happened. Zelensky does this. He is a leader. He is an example to the rest of the world. And when people put him down and criticize him for the fact that he doesn't wear a suit like mine with a yellow tie, that's ridiculous.
He'll wear that for the Victory Day, I'm sure.
Well, there you go. Well, they should look at pictures of Churchill during World War II, or any leader during a war. I'm sorry. Anyway, I don't want to get off on just Zelensky, because really the most important point here is the fact that the European leaders are not emulating President Zelensky. Apparently, they don't get it yet. And in my opinion, that's not just because of Russian disinformation, although that's a huge part of all of this. Cyber attacks and out-and-out sabotage and so forth. It's corruption. And I'm going to circle around to this point in a couple of minutes. NATO, specifically the EU, is very critical of Ukraine. And you wrote something about this fairly recently. about corruption in Ukraine and how they are addressing it. The EU is very critical of Ukraine and their history of corruption since the Soviet Union and how they really need to clean up their act before they can be admitted to the EU, which is true. And I support this. But my dear God, look at some of the examples even you just mentioned. Olaf Scholz, for example, any number of the CEOs of the major corporations in Europe, some of which are still operating in Russia right now, not even covertly, overtly. And the rest of them are still shipping parts to Russia through shadow fleets and secondary and third sources. I think if the EU and Europe as a whole wants to talk about Ukraine cleaning up their corruption, they need to get their act together first.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. But I'll tell you one thing, knowing Ukraine well and studying for a while, is that there's a very strong internal demand to clean up Ukraine. Ukraine is not doing it for EU. Ukraine is doing it to win the war, and Ukraine is doing it to actually become an effective state. If in this battle of Goliath and David, Ukraine has to, as a smaller state, has to be more productive, more effective, and more innovative. And that is not going to happen with the current sluggish system that is inherited from the Soviet time, where people are afraid to take initiative because some prosecutor will go after them in that or that agency, or that they are used to basically funneling budget funds. One good news is that that demand remains very, very strong. And even during the war, even with martial law, you would be impressed by the investigative journalist work to expose any corruption. And not only it's being exposed, but it's being reacted by the law enforcement agencies, by the president himself. For example, we have a case of desertion. Yes, and it's openly discussed. It's not put under the carpet. If there are cases of desertion, they're being investigated, and president is taking personal control. There's been a scandal where several Ukrainians that were trained in France have deserted, or they have deserted in France. So he said, and they were in quite large numbers. Obviously, it was a corrupt scheme. So Ukraine and the president is focusing on it. It's not being denied. And I think this is where the power of communication and leadership comes. It comes with honesty. People are not fools. You have to put, the truth on the table. And where in Ukraine the strength comes, where I think perhaps it's still lacking in the Western world, is that strong civil society that is almost raising all these issues to the surface through their work, and is itself acting in solving them. They are not waiting only for the state to take action. They are designing software, for example, to do procurement, to cut the corners of red tape. They are looking for solutions. And I think this is where the lesson from Ukraine comes for our future, is that it's unfortunately, we cannot afford a citizen just being a consumer or just being a voter. We must become an active contributors to security and prosperity of our societies. Otherwise, we will be eaten up by these autocracies that will corrode trust, and we will be all atomized. And one by one, it's very easy to take us. So our leaders have to be honest and say, we cannot do it alone. It's not just the state that has responsibility for it. We can do, Navy, we can do fighter jets, we can do maybe drones, but you people have to do this and this and this. The sooner we start doing it, like Ukraine, like Finland, by the way, the better it is.
Well, again, I know you wrote an article, a piece about this recently, where you said that Ukraine is fighting two wars. They're fighting Putin and they're fighting corruption at the same time because they have to. And I am impressed about their anti-corruption efforts. In fact, I interviewed a while back the director and some of the journalists with Slitsvo.info, the investigative journalists in Ukraine. And just, I was amazed. I mean, the work that they do under the conditions under which they have to operate, and the successes that they've had is just incredible to me. In fact, and I was criticized for that by Ukrainians at the time because of exposing the corruption in Ukraine, and I was told, why don't I just concentrate on the battlefield successes and not concentrate on the negative? For the reasons you just said. No, that's ridiculous. You have to confront both. Ukrainian society as a whole, I think, is supportive of doing this and confronting both. You can't have one without the other. If you win the war and you go back to the Soviet Union days, well, what have you won? Nothing.
Yeah.
No. So anyway, I'm aware of a lot of the anti-corruption efforts. You have an anti-corruption court, prosecutors. You have a whole infrastructure in Ukraine dedicated to this, more so than almost any countries in the EU.
But just
Go ahead.
because we have a
Yeah.
lot of American audience here, to say
Yes.
that on top of that, since the invasion, there are two inspector generals who are monitoring all U.S. assistance that is going inside Ukraine through the USAID and to the Ministry of Defense, and they have not reported any cases of corruption in 3 years. So that is something also is the stamp of approval that Ukraine is trying to carefully allocate all Western assistance for the purposes it has been given to Ukraine.
Well, there was one case recently where it was I believe, a deputy defense minister who was fired and recently indicted for inflating the prices of the military equipment and taking kickbacks, possibly putting the money in his own bank account. That's not normal. It's rare, but he was prosecuted. He was fired. But that's the kind of things that American audiences key in on. That's the kinds of things that MAGA, Trump, and the Republicans in America key in on. They don't look at all of the other 99.9% of the successful cases of the money being allocated where it's supposed to, and the very limited amount of corruption at higher levels. They key in on a case like that. So it's unfortunate, but the fact is it was investigated. There is an investigation, and severe action was already taken. And I think that's what needs to be focused on. Let me move on to another area that I know that you research and write about, and that is disinformation. Europe right now is in rough shape in terms of far right radical political parties succeeding more than they have possibly or probably since the end of World War II, especially in countries like Germany, Hungary. Forget that with Orban, but you've got Germany, you've got France with a possible return of Le Pen. Even in Holland and Sweden, you have far right parties that are more successful. Talk a little bit about the Russian concerted Russian disinformation campaign and how successful have they been in recent times in turning not turning, but in leading the narrative in Europe?
I think Russians are experts in riding this wave of discontent and anger that is brewing in all of our societies, from the United States to France to the UK. You see people are dissatisfied with the way economy is going, with the way their future looks like. And Russians are finding the scapegoats for that through their disinformation campaign, who are inconvenient for them. So, of course, they would blame the mainstream parties who are resolute on supporting Ukraine, saying that, that they are taking this money from you instead of, let's say, giving you an extra subsidy for energy. Although, if you compare funds spent on inside the European Union on energy support after the Russian invasion to the household, it's in trillion compared to the assistance that Ukraine have received, which is in billions. So they are, of course, obscuring all those facts, and they are just spinning the anger against the system, against the elites, against the centrist parties, putting the blame on them for people's hardships. So that social media field, and I am really concerned, especially after recent statements by Meta, that they are not gonna curate or fact check any content on the platform. That will only open the watershed of more and more disinformation and more partition and frictions within our societies. You know, democracies depend on consensus building. We cannot govern ourselves if we cannot reach some common ground. And this is what Russians are so dangerous. And I think it's time to really take defense for that. And that could be done, you know, there's no one silver bullet how this could be done, but there's a real risk that on that wave of anger, parties like, you know, ones in Austria, for example, now, the future chancellor, possible chancellor who has the neo-Nazi rhetoric, the German, and what happened in Romania, that the Constitutional Court had to annul results of the elections because of Russian interference and successful Russian interference into the recent elections. So here, what is at stake? Russia militarily is not able to achieve its goals. We see that in Ukraine, in 1 year, they've lost nearly 500,000 men and have taken 400,000 square kilometers of land, which is nothing. They've taken 2 regional towns. So they bogged down in Ukraine and not able to achieve their results. So they use other means, and those means are, you know, cables in the Black Sea, the kind of below kinetic threshold attacks. It's plotting explosions in the factories that are providing munitions to Ukraine, going after CEO of defense companies like Rheinmetall in Germany. And the Russians are attacking us on all fronts, minus the you know, missiles, drones that they are so far keeping in stock.
Very recently, as I'm sure you're aware, our soon-to-be president, Trump, has made many startling statements about how he may either attempt to buy or, if that fails, invade some of our allies, including Greenland, which is a wholly owned territory by Denmark, Canada, Mexico, and Panama. His allies, of course, say that he's not serious, which is BS. Trump is serious about everything he says. We should have learned a long time ago that not to underestimate him and not to take what he says as a joke or it's just being Trump. In fact, there was a new story in the Moscow Times, English language newspaper in exile from Russia, about the fact that many Trump advisors have recently been speaking with Putin and with the Kremlin. And specifically, Trump has been talking to Putin before he's been inaugurated and talking about a vast number of issues. And I just want to quote from this story. It's about how Trump is saying he may militarily seize some of these assets from our allies. And this Kremlin source says quite bluntly, Putin enjoys this immensely because it creates additional points of tension between the U.S. and its allies. And it's also a great narrative for Putin to justify his actions and these double standards. And it goes on to say many, many other things. We knew this, of course. Putin and the Kremlin are sitting back and just laughing at the circus that's going on right now, even before Trump is inaugurated. What about that? What about the actions and words of the Trump administration and how that feeds into Russian disinformation?
It's a torrent of words that is very threatening and also very destabilizing. And it's coming from the most powerful country in the world, from the United States. And that is very, you know, disconcerting. So I think that not only it's music to Putin's ears, that it may, may create tensions between Europe and United States, but it's actually imperialist rhetoric he himself is employing for his war against Ukraine. I think that that narrative legitimizes all autocrats, including China. I'm not sure Trump is thinking 2 steps ahead in that way, but this resembles 1945 when, the world was carved out and divided, between the winners of the Second World War on the spheres of influence and lands for grabs. It will be very unfortunate if Putin, by, I would argue, losing the war, will get the victory. By losing the war, we are actually at the moment when Putin is weakest. He is not the strongest. His economy is under enormous pressure. And by allowing him to get off this hook and granting territorial accessions, legitimizing them in any way, would be an enormous gift to the autocrat, and it will embolden him to a great degree. I think that we'll wait and see how that situation is resolved, but just the very statements of that send a signal to the Kremlin that, actually they are right, that force is a legitimate tool to achieve its foreign policy objectives.
Well, and the fact that we're just about to appoint an alcoholic, drug abuser, alleged rapist as the Secretary of Defense in the United States and a lapdog of Donald Trump does not make me feel very warm and fuzzy inside about the future in terms of whether or not Trump gives the green light to invade someplace like Panama or Greenland or anywhere else in the world just on a whim. He didn't have those supporters last time. He does now. I can't think of any senior official or court that's going to stop Donald Trump from doing virtually anything. Let me ask you this as one of the final questions, if I can. What do you believe? Again, Trump's going to be in power next week. What do you believe is the least, or let me put it this way, the most territorial concessions that President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people would accept in any kind of a peace proposal or settlement to end the war?
I would say that Ukrainians, the only concession that Ukrainians can make is to agree to a temporary occupation of its territory by Russia. The concession means right now Ukraine has no military force to retake those lands, but Ukraine will never legally consider this territory as Russia. As it was from 2014 after the annexation of Crimea, the annexation of other regions are no different from that. So I think that should be the policy of United States as well, like it was during the occupation of the Baltic states by the Soviet Union, that Russia will not get any legal rights to these lands that will be accepted. That is the red line that President Zelensky cannot cross, because he will be held criminal in Ukraine. It's in violation of Ukrainian constitution, and Ukrainian people at this point, 62% are against any territorial concessions to Russia in exchange of peace. So this is the situation where, as I said, Russia is on the back footing. It's not winning the war. So there's no reason why they should get any concessions in terms of territory. What they have achieved militarily and Ukraine cannot retake will remain under occupation.
So you believe that if offered, the President Zelensky and the Ukrainian people might agree to a ceasefire with the Russian military staying within the occupied territories, but agreeing not to advance any further and possibly under the auspices of a NATO force to guarantee that?
Well, here is a tricky question about what can guarantee Ukraine from reinvasion at the ceasefire moment. Ukraine had 17 ceasefires with Russia since 2014, and all of them were violated. Because, as I said, Putin did not reach his war aims. He is not able to do it now. That's why he may want a ceasefire to take off the pressure from his economy, and also to avoid another mobilization, which we do know he doesn't want to do inside Russia. So Ukraine, of course, the plan A is to have a membership in NATO that has a partial application of Article 5 only on the territory that is currently controlled by Kiev. That is the golden standard of security guarantees. If that is not possible, which is likely because we do know that Trump said no NATO for Ukraine and no US security guarantees for Ukraine, then Ukraine will have to build on these bilateral security agreements that it has signed with other allies, and Ukraine has signed 22 of those, in order to build some kind of a framework that will include defense, cooperation, that will include training for Ukrainian army, that will possibly include deployment, but that is not going to be UN, because Russia will not agree to any UN peacekeeping mission, and we know these missions are toothless if the ceasefire is violated. So it will have to be the coalition of the brave countries that understand why Ukraine should have an iron shield between the territory it controls and Russia. Will have to come to that, and it will be a cheaper investment for those countries in the shielding Ukraine than in having to fight Russia in direct combat.
I surely don't know what Trump or his advisors have in mind for ending the war. I do know that Trump has nothing in mind, because he doesn't have anything in his mind except for making money. He doesn't have a plan. He doesn't have any ideology. It's whatever he thinks is going to benefit him the best.
Zelensky is thinking, what can I buy from Trump? This is one of the strategies that always worked.
Yeah.
That's why he pitched him, access to some critical minerals in Ukraine. And he said, why don't Ukrainians replace US boots on the ground in Eastern Europe? I think in that way, he's smart because he talks Trump language.
Oh, absolutely. No, you can work Trump. You can cater to his idiosyncrasies, to his greed, and to his lack of knowledge of history and international affairs and diplomacy. There's no question about that. I think Putin has and will play him like a fool, like a child in the future, and that's unfortunate. I don't know what, of course, what President Zelensky or the Ukrainian people would accept for a ceasefire. As you said, you can't trust the Russians. They've broken every agreement they've ever agreed to. I can't imagine, though, leaving Russian forces anywhere in the occupied territories and not expecting them to regroup, rearm, retrain, and then to invade the rest of Ukraine without a standing force from NATO to guarantee that that wouldn't happen. But as we've said, I don't know if that's going to happen. I don't know if NATO has the backbone to do that. So I don't know. It's going to be a very interesting next few months. I'm optimistic, as I always am, but I'm also a realist, and I really hope that Putin insults Donald Trump, which is very easy to do, and as a reaction, because he has very thin skin, he decides to teach Putin a lesson. And I think that's one of the only ways this is going to turn out in Ukraine's favor, but we shall see. Orysia Lutsevych, thank you so much for joining me on the No Delusion Zone today. It's been a terrific discussion, and I thank you very much. I hope we do it again in the future. So please stay safe, and as always, stay sane.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure and very interesting conversation. And follow also our work of Chatham House. We have a lot of good content online and on social, and we also bust the myths and give real facts on the ground from Ukraine directly by having a lot of Ukrainians on our platform themselves to speak directly to the world.
Thank you for saying that. I would encourage all my viewers to in fact, go to the Chatham House website. They do great work. Read their reports and some of the videos that they make. A lot of them talk on different podcasts and different conferences and so forth. So please go to Chatham House in the UK and you will learn a lot. Again, Orysia, thank you so much. Take care and let's do this again soon.
Thanks a lot. Stay well.